Greetings everyone. Welcome to today's lecture on Bhakti, the language of devotion and rebellion. In this topic, we would be discussing how this religion of masses was different from the traditional concept of religion. This new concept of Bhakti brought religion closer to the masses. The Bhaktas rejected Sanskrit because they felt this was the language of the elite and could not connect to the common people. So, as has been marked by Kabir, Sanskrit is like still water of the well, while the vernaculars were like the flowing of a river. That is, they were full of life and brought about change. Now, it is in this background that we would be discussing specifically the role of women. Though many historians have mentioned that this popular nature of Bhakti movement was due to the Bhakti saints taking up the cause of common people and believing in egalitarianism. However, a point that has remained neglected and an aspect that has remained underemphasized is the role of women in the Bhakti movement that emerged in India from early medieval period onwards. As we are going to discuss role of women, it would be undertaken with the reference to large scale participation of females that gave Bhakti movement the character of a mass movement. So, religion was the only space that was open to women in medieval times, and this was made fully use by them. So, the women made full use of this legitimate space that was available to them, and it was through this legitimate space that they defined their actions, aspirations, and participated in public gatherings. They also could visit pilgrimage places, composed their own songs, hymns, bhajans, and through bhakti they claimed to directly reach God without the influence of mediators. So, it was this legitimate space that helped them sow the seed of an idea that women could be agents of their own religious emancipation, and also they could exercise their own agency. So, what emerged was the image of women as divine rebels. Examining the role of women in the Bhakti movement, one can say that women took recourse to the religious emotion in order to deal with the challenges of patriarchy, and while doing so, they were also able to create an alternate space for themselves, both in society as well as in religion. So, as we explore this theme of women as divine rebels, we can talk about how they challenged patriarchy by extending the definition of love to God as a lover, as a wife, as a mistress, a friend, or as a servant. So, these were the wide varieties of roles that women perceived of themselves. And also, a point that needs to be made emphatically, that these were rebels with a cause. They defied patriarchal norms of marriage and walked out of their domestic space, except in the case of a few bhaktas like Bahina Bai. The women in Bhakti movement found the courage to defy the patriarchal family ties, and either they walked out of their homes and the restricted spaces of patriarchal control, or they ended up changing their husbands to their way of thinking and to their way of livelihood. So, what emerges is that how the non-inclusive agenda that till now had been promoted by religion was being tackled. However, it is not to say that the Bhakti movement per se was inclusive as far as gender issues were concerned. Majority of the Bhakti saints were very critical of all the institutions, and they revolted against idolatry, tyranny of castes and creeds, along with the temples and rituals. But in this change, they were not really seeking a change in the lives of women, and women had been kept aloof from this process of revolutionary thinking. So, while these Bhakti saints were protesting very vocally against the prevalent injustice in society in terms of caste, creed, etc., but they conveniently left out women from this discussion, and hence they relegated women to the background. Therefore, from a closer analysis, it emerges that Bhakti also emerged as a male bastion, and it also kind of reinforced the same kind of gender inequality that was prevalent in the traditional religion. A woman had no place in the change that was being sought. It was a change that was being defined by male parameters. So therefore, the whole process of how women could lead non-traditional, non-conformist lives, the burden of this squarely lay on the shoulders of female bhaktas. Several women saints started leading non-traditional, non-conformist lives and started talking of individual freedom. While they were leading new kind of non-traditional and non-conformist lives, their divine or outpourings started coming from the heart, and they started singing unfettered and within a domain that they carved out for themselves. So, in due course of time, several female bhaktas came to be deified, and they came to be worshipped in this life and immediately after their death also. It is the need of hour to reclaim the lost voices of female bhaktas. There is a need to rehabilitate these unfettered voices of the female bhaktas into mainstream historiography that has been done by several historians. By integrating these voices, we will be taking a small step towards creating a gender inclusive history. Also, one needs to keep in mind that there were several silent supporters of female bhaktas, and this aspect also has largely been underemphasized as to who were the followers and how these female bhaktas, despite leading lives of non-conformity and challenging the patriarchal notions, were able to have a following. And who were the silent supporters of these female bhaktas? This shows that in addition to having an audience that was regular, the women bhaktas also had a captive audience who must have provided both material as well as emotional support to them. And as they were challenging the dominant discourse, Bhakti poetry came to offer a venue, came to offer an alternative avenue that would challenge the paradigms as well as the dominant discourses. So, rise of several women poets in the Bhakti tradition proved to be a challenge ultimately to the masculinity and also to patriarchy that was manifested in several forms. And as they were challenging the dominant discourse, the textuality of the female bhakta poets, of the tradition that they were kind of reinventing, also represents a metaphorical transgression, that is, the appropriation of a male dominated medium, that is, the appropriation of the textual tradition, the appropriation of poetry that clearly had been male dominated for so long. So as these women were trying to define themselves, the feminist historian Tanika Sarkar in Words to Win has argued that the right to be textual transferred the power of self-definition to women. So it was not a small thing or an insignificant thing that women had started composing, and this in itself indicated that there was transfer of some kind of authority and power from the male to the female. The society had prescribed the making of the feminine as an act of conformation with specific moral and religious codes. And as women started composing poems or bhajans or songs, they were definitely posing a threat to this very rigid and limited moral and religious code. So, by writing about the life and reality as women experienced them, the textual woman could translate herself out of the language of the patriarchy and write in her own words and also give expression to her own emotions and thoughts, which were definitely anti-patriarchal. An alternative path that emerged in course of Bhakti movement also was an effective strategy that was adopted by the female poets of Bhakti tradition, and that was an alternative path of love. In Bhakti poet, eroticism and love took on the nature of free transcendence. So therefore, female bhaktas redefined the nature of eroticism as well as the nature of devotion and the path of love. So lovers do not recognize the roles imposed upon them by society. Similarly, these female bhaktas refused to accept the kind of limitations that had been imposed on them so far. So while doing so, while writing, they were also challenging the old order. While the Smriti literature had demanded invisibility and complete submission from women, these female bhaktas from 8th, 9th centuries onwards adopted the nomadic as well as the oral traditions of the Bhakti movement and carried movement far ahead of their times. And as they were challenging the old order, the ethos of Bhakti undid much of the Puranic theocracy and also the old Brahmanical order. So Bhakti movement challenged the rules of caste, the stages of life, as well as the rigid gender binaries that had been imposed. So one can clearly say that Bhakti movement gave vent to the voices of margins. The once marginalized sections of society definitely raised their voices through the vehicle of Bhakti poetry. And the long suffering tenets of the feudal lords and also the peasants who were dependent, the tenants who were dependent on the feudal lords, as well as the Shudra slaves who had been suffering for so long, as well as women who succumbed to patriarchy and so many other marginal sections of society like the Tawayafs or the concubines. The Bhakti movement made it possible for both men and women of these several categories to uphold their dignity in the face of severe societal oppression as well as repression. So, one can say that Bhakti also posed a challenge to phallocentric religions, because phallocentrism, that is belief in the superiority of male sexuality, allowed men to control the religious concept of morality. So, women came to be conceived of as the keepers of morality, while their bodies as essentially sinful, and their chastity came to be intricately tied to the idea of honor, purity, piety, and the notion of purity and pollution also came to be added to this entire discourse. So, while the women were writing about their own lives and also were very explicit about their own sexuality, a pattern of social constraints on women as well as a bias against their inclusion into the public sphere came to be challenged by them time and again. So, in course of all this, they were ultimately rejecting the dogma, and soon Bhakti movement erupted onto the medieval scene, revolutionizing the relationship between women and religion, and they started challenging the old norms and the notions while rejecting the dogma. So the Vedic rituals and rites which excluded femininity were abolished in favor of personal paths of worship. So the personal became very important, and the female bhakta personally chose a god, and she had freedom to imagine that god form as a husband or as a lover, as has been pointed out by Tharu and Lalita in course of their analysis. So they were breaking a number of taboos. The devotional poetry of women poets of the Bhakti movement did not seek to settle into the given paths of worship that had continued for several centuries. They drew largely on their everyday experiences, the traumas, the injustices that had been done to them, and also that had been internalized by women so far. So, the taboos of profanity and sacrilege were broken as women began to write of their own bodies, their own emotions, their own sexual desires, and they were doing all this within the realm of Bhakti religion. So, they were gradually doing away with the aspect of shame. Almost all medieval religions were they used to associate a woman's body with impurity and sin. So the normal biological functions of a female body like menstruation or childbirth were relegated into this domain of pollution, and this also was now questioned by these several female bhaktas. The idea of shame was born from this notion which was carried on to the present times. Bhakti poetry, however, did away with this notion of shame associated with the biological functions of a female body. Next very important development that took place was the free expression of desire. They rejected the normative institution of marriage that enforced the roles of husband and wife on people, and impulses were expressed in the lawlessness of love, and there was lot of celebration about these impulses, whether they were emotional impulses, maternal instincts or sexual desires. And as women were expressing desire, the love that was central to bhakti emerged as a chaotic expression, some kind of a lawlessness, some kind of a chaotic expression of desire, whereas the sacrosanct realm of faith had so far dealt in a very disciplined kind of a sane love. So what all was this was going to lead to? It was seen as leading to destabilization of authority, while the conventional religion presented love as a parental concept, and God as the loving father and the bhakta as the child of God, the father. However, the female bhaktas redefined this. The image of the father or child had allowed religion to exercise a natural authority and also to exercise a paternal authority. However, the arrival of the Bhakti movement destabilized the possibilities of absolute control. So there was no more this recourse to absolutism or control from above. Everything became individual based, and bhaktas and eroticism came to be synonymous with each other. So if we review the works of Bhakta poets from Andal to Mirabai, we realize that women Bhaktas created the image of the lover, that was God, and the relationship between these two was imbued with sexual connotations, and hence eroticism became very important part of female poetry. The female poets of this genre did not shy away from images of sex and descriptions of conjugality between the female Bhakta and the God. The terms of erotic desire were no longer being laid out by the society or by men only. So there was some kind of a positive sexual identity that emerged, and this also became an extension of the faith as well as the lived experiences of female Bhaktas. Eroticism was not reduced only to yearning or to shy submission to the male order. In fact, it had transgressed beyond all these limitations, and there was lot of positive sexual identity which emerged. Women came to be portrayed as an equal sexual partner, and Bhakti poetry constructed a feminine order of meaning which produced this kind of identity for women. And in this, they also kind of rejected the notion of sacred purity. So the female Bhaktas laid claim to a form of chastity by proclaiming their divine lords as their only lovers. And so this was what became a metaphor for worship. The notion of sacred purity was detested rather by several female Bhakta poets, and the body was projected as a path of sexual prayer and was to be treated with lot of respect and care. There was a complete rejection of the sense of the term chastity by these female Bhaktas, and their poems also demonstrate the ability to dictate the conditions of chastity, the power to choose a way of life, and the power to choose a partner. So while they were indulging in so much of non-conformism, they were also rejecting domesticity. The female poets of the Bhakti movement refused to conform to the notion of domesticity, and the public traditions of the Bhakti movement allowed females to escape the strict enforcement of religious moral control that had been the norm of the day. The political scenario provided a wide canvas on which many aspects of Bhakti movement played itself out, and yet Bhakti poetry did not confine itself only to a sexual or to a gender revolution within literature. They attacked several conformist ideas and institutions in society, and several female Bhaktas like Akka Mahadevi and Mirabai led the lives of recluses. Thank you.